oh, she must just be, the typical mixed race archetype, the Malinche figure, the Pocahontas figure, right? That brown woman who sleeps with the white soldier, as part of the sort of relations of empire that are almost happenstance. And then I started digging a little deeper. I realized that she was actually a person, and there was actually this person that was a significant part of Douglas MacArthur's life, but was disappeared from all the stories about him.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series. My name is Theo Gonzalves, and I'm a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. It's my great pleasure today to be in conversation with Professor Vernadette Gonzalez, who is a professor of American Studies at the University of Hawai at Manoa. She's written a new book called Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper. So the story of Douglas MacArthur is fascinating for US 20th century historians. He's one of the most widely respected US generals to have ever held office, a five-star general in command, but also he looms large in Philippine history as well, often seen as kind of liberator during World War II. And yet this other aspect of his life, his personal life, his affair with a Filipina, is something that is known in the Philippines, less widely known in the United States. And Vernadette is giving us an interesting way to think about this particular story on a very personal level. Vernadette, can you tell us about Isabel Cooper?
Sure. So Isabel Cooper, the reason I focused on her was because of her relationship with Douglas MacArthur. But as soon as I started to find out more about this figure, I wanted to pull her story away from him. In the total 5 decades that she was alive, this actor, she was mostly a stage and film actor, spent 10% of her life with MacArthur, if that. And so it was such a small part of her life, yet it's come to define her. And in so many ways, it haunts her well after the fact of the relationship. And so I wanted to dig a little deeper to see how I might understand her life as almost a text of the kind of relationships that consolidate empire, right? Empire isn't just about military occupation or political treaties, but it's also about the very interpersonal relationships that are the glue of how these kinds of projects of occupation make sense. So yeah, so Isabel Cooper is famous in her own right as an actor, but she becomes infamous as the mistress. And I wanted to explore that relationship, but then also then leave it behind and find other ways to think about what it must have been like for a mixed race Filipina to navigate the shifting relations of race, the different cities that she found herself in. She was very cosmopolitan, right? So what was it like for her to kind of deal with the aftermath of empire?
Let's get started right away about how the project began. What was your interest in telling this story?
So, as you know, Theo, from being my next door neighbor, former next door neighbor in American Studies, my work is normally on tourism and militarism in Hawaii and the Philippines. And so I tripped over this figure during the research for the first book, but I didn't have time to pursue it. My father is actually a World War II buff, and he brought us. I have this very clear memory of him bringing the whole family to Norfolk, Virginia, and part of that whole experience was almost having a pilgrimage, right, to the shrine to Douglas MacArthur that is in Norfolk. And so, this figure, Douglas MacArthur, is a really big figure in American and in Philippine history. And when I came across the first rumors, the first traces of this figure, Isabel Cooper, I started to get really interested in it. I actually She was actually a fictional character. I thought was somebody who was imagined by Ninotch Carrasca in a novel of hers, and I thought, oh, she must just be, the typical mixed race archetype, the Malinche figure, the Pocahontas figure, right? That brown woman who sleeps with the white soldier, as part of the sort of relations of empire that are almost happenstance. And then I started digging a little deeper. I realized that she was actually a person, and there was actually this person that was a significant part of Douglas MacArthur's life, but was disappeared from all the stories about him, including the one that he tells himself.
Mm. So this is partly a story about a romance, a failed romance, an affair with one of the United States' most celebrated military figures. But it also is in many ways a way to rightfully set Isabel Cooper in her place in Philippine and also in American history. And so it kind of has the feel of a mystery, kind of a ghost story, and then also a bit of a romance too. But I think what's fascinating and what's interesting about your choice of the book is that it doesn't foreground MacArthur. It's not the story of his affair. It's really the story of her life, and also your recovery of her memory, like how we remember her as well. So this is really fascinating. I want to get to the questions of method and archive a little bit later, but let's talk about Isabel Cooper by first talking about her mother. And
Sure.
I think you do something really great in these introductory chapters, and it's on, I guess, page 47. So I'm going to read a quick excerpt, and here you're describing Isabel's mother's names, and so she's going by different names as well. And on page 47, you say Protasia, the unbiddable wife, and Josefina, the scandalous and opportunistic bigamist, provided the blueprint of feminine survival that Isabel Cooper would draw on again and again. Could you talk about Isabel Cooper by way of her mother? Can we get to the mother story? Because there's something really quite fascinating about her relationships, particularly at that time in the Philippines.
So her mother was sort of a revelation to me. When I started to look at Isabel Cooper's early life, I realized that there was very little to be known about her mother and even her father, who was a white American soldier from Wisconsin who happened to ship out to the Philippines during the Philippine American War. Her mother was this much younger Filipina who was orphaned, and really in some ways the story has it right, and there's a lot of this sort of the story has it
Mhm.
because we don't quite know. She was married off to this older white American at that point in the story. He's not no longer a soldier. He's he works as a fireman in the Manila Firemen's Corps. And Protasia is somebody who's interesting because she's younger, but she holds power in that relationship.
Mhm.
Um, you know, she holds enough power in the sense that when Isaac Cooper, her husband, decides to return to the United States in 1916, when his job was going to be transferred over to a Filipino, he brings his wife, his Filipino wife, and his mixed race kids with him to Arizona. And that kind of recognition of a Filipina as his wife and these mixed race kids as his children, his legitimate children, was really unusual at the time, right? You didn't see a whole lot of that. Most of the time, the women were abandoned, the
Right.
men returned. And then shortly thereafter, right around World War I breaking out, she decides to book it. She leaves Arizona. She leaves Isaac. She brings at least a couple of her kids back with her and marries somebody else. And we
Mhm.
don't know if there was an official divorce or even if there was an official marriage to the first husband. So all
Right.
these kinds of documentation of their relationship is unclear. But you see this woman navigating entire oceans and
Hmm.
deciding to take up with different men, another American soldier closer to her own age, um, and so you see these kinds of patterns that that Isabel's mother kind of laid out. And her daughter was somebody who was coming into her own, was observing all these things. And I think that she learned a lot from her mother's example.
So that becomes an important marker for her, important lesson, because it's scandal on both sides. I mean, on the one hand, the father is violating all these interesting racial codes and miscegenation, anti-miscegenation codes by
Right.
bringing this mixed race family into the United States. And why Arizona in particular?
I'm not entirely sure. He's from
Mhm.
Wisconsin, and I don't think that he had family necessarily in Arizona. Maybe he had friends. He sets up as a laborer there. There's not any sense of any deeper connection to Arizona.
Right,
But that's where they
right.
end up when
Yeah.
they get off the ship in San Francisco.
So not only is he breaking all kinds of interesting mores, sexual mores, by bringing his mixed race family into the continental United States, the mother is also entering into scandal, and it's unclear about the marriage status. So this becomes a kind of template for young Isabel.
Mm.
As she grows up, she's now kind of growing up around the same time as the young American Republic during the colonial period, the Philippines under the American colonial period, and so things are starting to change. I mean, these mores are starting to come loose, and the picture that you're painting of Manila is interesting because she's getting a bird's eye view of these relationships from the perspective of a performer, a very young performer, like a preteen, really kind of hitting the vaudeville stages. Can you talk about how she really gets started getting to work, being on those stages, and what vaudeville was like as a kind of cultural art form that gets imported, but then also rooted in the Philippines?
Right. So vaudeville was a very American art form that came in. Isabel was very young when she, at some point she says she was 5. So that means that she was already on vaudeville stages as a small child before the family left for Arizona, and then she comes back
Yeah.
in 1919, and that's also, it happens to coincide also with sort of the dawn, really, the moment that
Mm-hmm.
Filipino modern film comes into its
Mm-hmm.
own.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all these actors, these producers, these filmmakers who somehow got to Hollywood and then came back to the islands, right? And wanted to create their own vernacular of Philippine film, but modern. And they see, they're looking for modern stories that have a Filipino, um, uh, that is also very Filipino in terms of the cast, in terms of the storylines, the kind of uh, familiar plot lines. And so, they are looking to cast, this is Jose Nepomuceno and Vicente Salombides, and they look to cast a sort of a face for the film, and they see Isabel Cooper on stage, and they go, that's the one, right? So
Mm.
she plays actually this model who is on a magazine that is somebody falls in love with, the lead character falls in love with, and her mixed race beauty, right? So there's this sort of
Yeah.
idea of her, and she leverages that on stage as well as in the film. She leverages that as a thing that is her niche, because chorus girls are a dime a dozen, and she's a chorus girl. That's what she is, right? She's not particularly special at this point, but at that point, when she is sort of discovered on film, she becomes the face of the modern Filipina.
Yeah.
And this is all happening in Manila right around the time when there are all these debates about suffrage, about modernity, and a lot of those kinds of ideas about modernity and suffrage adhere to the idea of who is this Filipina? What do our women do in the new nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Isabel is coming into her own as a performer right during that same time.
Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating is she's making this transition from the vaudeville stage to this new medium of film. And Filipino audiences, or particularly those in Manila, are beginning to see these new codes take shape, getting influenced by American film culture. As she participates in this film career, she becomes known for something really special in Philippine film history. Can you talk about what she's really known for in those early films, 1925, 1926?
Absolutely. So in her second film, Jose Nepomuceno decides that he wants to film the first screen kiss in Filipino screen history. And he convinces Isabel Cooper, who's around 16, 17 at the time. She's young, right?
Wow. Yeah.
To represent that sort of figure, the one of the people who kiss on film. And they film it in front of an Augustinian church, which
Huh.
also, became a
Hmm.
scandal. Um, and during this time, a lot of whatever love scenes you saw on film were coming from Hollywood films, and so there's a certain distance, even as people were being scandalized by what was allowed on screen. But to see one of your own, right, this beautiful young Filipina kissing on screen on this giant screen, it seemed like, I think, a slap in the face to a lot of people, but also very titillating to others, right? This is in during the roaring 20s, and so you're seeing this figure of Isabel Cooper be sort of a lightning rod for a lot of ideas about how a Filipina ought to behave, what she ought to look like, how she should dress, what she should or shouldn't be doing with men.
Right. And you describe her in this time of her career as the quintessential American ingenue, young and modern, the new Filipina. She becomes a household name. So as a result of this screen kiss, this moment in Philippine film history, she's really becoming iconic. And it seems like it would have a shock in a generally conservative country, but also it's a country that's not static. It's on the move with kind of trying to figure out its own sense of identity and its relationship to modernity. What happens with these films, with her film career? Where does she go after that?
She actually tries to make it in Hollywood, right? Whether who advised her to do that or what, there had not been any successful actors to that point who had actually made it into Hollywood in terms of
Hmm.
Asian Filipino actors. And so she tries in the late 1920s to go to Hollywood. Whether it's folded in with a visit to her dad, who at that point
Mm.
lived in Hollywood, lived in LA, is another story. But she's gone for a while, and we don't know exactly really what happens during that period of time that she is in LA. She narrates a whole story back in a Philippine journal, sort of a Life magazine, sort of the People magazine of its era, about going about in Hollywood and trying to audition for different kinds of things, being noticed. But in the end, there's nothing that happens. She is not cast in anything. She actually narrates a casting couch incident, right? And so, in a sense, she writes herself into a scene that isn't filmed, but is very cinematic in a way, right?
Right.
And She returns back to the Philippines in 1928, 1929, right around the time that Douglas MacArthur also comes to the Philippines, returns back to the Philippines. He's been to the
Right.
Philippines several times. So he returns to the Philippines, and that's around the time when his first marriage is starting to dissolve. His socialite wife has filed for divorce. So
Hmm.
that is the moment where I think they meet, right?
Right.
And maybe he's seen her before on stage, but they don't actually have a relationship prior to that.
Right. So her return to the Philippines would have been written up in the papers and magazines.
Yeah.
Here's this iconic star who was known for this incredible kiss. She goes out to Hollywood. Things uh, seems
Don't
like it
work out.
fizzles for a little bit.
Yeah.
Now she's back home. She's hitting the stages again, and in some either on some stage or some gathering, she meets MacArthur, who's the son of another general who happened to participate in the U.S. Philippine War. Um, so this now begins an interesting relationship with MacArthur and with Cooper, and it almost kind of parallels some interesting histories of migration that Filipino laborers.
Sure.
She ends up coming back to the Philippines. I'm sorry, going from the Philippines to the United States at MacArthur's request. How does that happen in 1930?
So in 1929, MacArthur is recalled back to the United States. He leaves for a command in San Francisco, actually, and we know that because that's where we have evidence of the letters that he writes her as he leaves Manila and sails across the Pacific. And there are various stops along the way in Tokyo and Shanghai. And so he narrates his love to her across the ocean.
Mm,
Um, in 1930, President Hoover asks him to serve as his chief of staff. And that is when he decides that it would be really great if Isabel could come over to Washington, D.C. and leave her career and be with him. And so he has all these promises of love to her,
mm,
and convinces her to board that boat. And she arrives in New York later that year.
mhm,
So yeah, so she leaves a very promising career. She's probably around 20 around this time,
mm,
20, 21
mhm,
years old, and he's in his 50s. And maybe she's starting to see, what the lifetime of stage work, or
mm,
just how much time she has left as an actor on stage and on screen, right? It's a
mm,
very
mhm.
limited time, and so maybe she's trying to cast around for different kinds of opportunities at that point. And you have this very powerful man. He was one of the most powerful men in the Philippines when he was there, and now he's the chief of staff of the army, for a president. And he
Yeah,
sets her up in a love nest in Washington, D.C.
right. And so what would seem to be lopsided, I mean, he's clearly this kind of important military figure and administrative figure. It and yet you say something on page 18 of your book, and I want to quote this because it kind of captures again the character of their relationship. And keep in mind, there's this is a general, and then of the United States Army, but then there's also this Filipino actress who's coming and completely out of sorts in Washington D.C. And yet you state on page 18, she
Mhm.
wields considerable emotional power in their relationship. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So one of the only pieces of evidence we have of their relationship are these letters he writes to her. There are no letters back that we know of. Maybe she wrote back, but he probably would have destroyed them because they were evidence of something salacious. Um, so in the letters, you see this deep emotional attachment he has to Isabel, right?
Mm-hmm.
He is smitten, and you could maybe psychologize this and go, well, he just is coming fresh from a divorce. His masculinity really needs propping up. And here's this beautiful Filipina performer at the prime of her career, the prime
Mm-hmm.
of her life, who, is in a relationship with him. And why wouldn't he want that? But it also shows how much he depends on that for his own self-worth, right? And
Right.
so you see, in his own words, the kind of emotional power she wielded over him, even though if you look on paper, she's she doesn't compare in terms of status, in terms
Yeah.
of power, other kinds of power, cultural power, social power. She's a nobody, really, and especially in
Mm-hmm.
Washington, D.C. But he's so attached to her, and you can see the kind of insecurity that he has when he's not sure that she's going to board that boat. He's constantly telling her to board the boat. Later on in the relationship, when he is touring Europe, right, as the general who's checking over the troops, you see these kinds of scenarios that he paints for her in these postcards he sends her, these telegrams about how, oh, I got awarded this medal, like I was treated like a king. And so it was really about this sort of, you know, I want to remind you how great I really am, as if, she
Still trying
wouldn't
to
know.
impress her.
He's trying to impress her. And so it's a really kind of interesting, you know you have to kind of read between the lines a little bit, but not that much really, to get
Right.
a sense of just how attached to her he was, but also how almost fearful he was of her youth, her ability to leave, and how much his self-worth as a man depended
Mm.
on this figure, this Filipino
Hmm.
woman.
Hmm. So as he spends more time in Europe, his reputation is on the rise at that point for the several years. What is she doing in DC?
Well, there are rumors that she went to art school. I could not find any evidence of that. She made up a lot of stories too, right? So there are rumors that is she does go back to school, and that's where she meets this young lawyer who eventually actually becomes her first husband after the MacArthur affair ends. And
Mm-hmm.
but she goes around. She goes to nightclubs. He pays for lots of outings that she has, and so he's over in Europe, and she's having a grand old time in DC, even as she's um, also by herself. At
Mm.
one point, he leaves for Europe, and she leaves and goes to Havana, which
Yeah.
is like party central during this time, right?
Right.
She goes to Havana and has a great time. So we don't know what she does there, but that's where she decides to go. So you can see their relationship start to fray a little bit, and a little bit of jealousy happening here. Um,
Yeah.
so, you can see that she was able to extract these kinds of gifts from him. He paid, certainly she didn't pay
Mm.
for her own trip to Havana. She didn't have any income. And so, you're starting to see the relationship start to fall apart at this point.
Right. And so she wasn't acting. I mean, she's just really
No.
a kept person and partying whenever she could. I mean, I found that part really interesting and seemingly kind of a place that you could insert all sorts of interesting stories.
I
She's going up to
know.
Baltimore. She's going to Havana.
Yeah.
And it must have been a rocking time. So tell me, and what's fascinating about this too is 1930, when she comes to the United States, it got me to think about the fact that there's this other Filipino American who comes, or this other Filipino who comes to the United States at the time, and it's Carlos Bolosan, and thousands of Filipinos are coming toward the end of the 1920s to the continent, and they're coming at the worst possible time. It's the Depression.
Great Depression.
People
Right.
they're getting blamed for so-called job losses, and also losing white women to these Filipinos. So it becomes a violent time. There's anti-Asianism it's been in the air. It helped to pass the 1924 Act. And here Filipinos, these two interesting Filipinos, Bolosan on one side of the continent and Cooper on the other, are kind of working out these interesting bargains and experiences. So toward the end of their relationship, it ends around the same time as the Tynings-McDuffie Act. So in 1934, it seems to be
34.
over.
Yes. So in 1934, they break up. And it's interesting that you mention the Filipino men, right? Because at that point, I think one of the precipitating factors of their breakup, or maybe, MacArthur had just had it at that point with her asking for things, was her brother, who had just gotten out of jail and was paroled, right? I found this great mugshot of him.
Is he
And
in LA?
he was in LA, and
Mhm.
he, she wanted to ask for help for her brother and her dad, and the
Mhm.
kiss off letter is actually included in the archives of letters that she kept from him, where he's basically telling her, no, go get a job, and apply to the
Hmm.
Humane Society for for help.
Oh.
Don't come to me anymore. We're done. And it's
Mhm.
typed, it's not handwritten like all his other letters.
Wow.
And yeah, so you have this woman who's essentially also kicked out, right? Their relationship is over. The Tidings McDuffie Act, writ small,
Yeah.
is in effect for
Yeah.
her relationship. And so she sort of disappears, but then reappears rather precipitously, much to
Hmm.
MacArthur's chagrin, because what we then get is a very famous muckraker at the time, Drew Pearson, who was
Mhm.
doing his journalist circuit in Washington, D.C., and really, really good at his job. He gets sued by MacArthur for libel.
Mhm.
MacArthur is a favorite subject of his, and he is not a fan of MacArthur, but he gets sued for libel. And during that time, Drew Pearson was trying to figure out, how do I get this general off my back? He hears the rumor about the former mistress. It's not a real close kept secret in DC. He
Mhm.
hears a rumor about her. He finds somebody to hunt her down, and she hands the
Because
letters
she's
over
no
to him.
longer staying at the place that
She's no longer. She
MacArthur
has
had put her
left.
up.
Yeah. So she's no longer in the Castleton Hotel in DC. So she's wandering around. I think she's trying to find a job because she has no income.
Mm.
Maybe she's, I don't know. She probably left that relationship with jewelry and a nice wardrobe. So maybe
Mm.
she's sold those things in order to survive and figure out her next steps. Maybe
Hmm.
she's trying to head back into entertainment.
Mhm.
Um, so somehow he tracks her down, and in exchange for the letters, and which caused MacArthur to drop his libel suit like that,
Hmm.
right? Because
Wow.
here's evidence of, an affair that, he probably even at that point had political ambitions later on. And so
Hmm.
he drops his libel suit. He gets the originals of the letters. We only have them because Drew Pearson's lawyer photocopied them and
Wow.
kept them in his archive, right? So she promises never to have anything to do with MacArthur ever again. And
Hmm.
for $15,000, she basically gets the kiss off.
Wow. So that's the settlement as a
That's the
result
settlement.
of the dropping of the lawsuit. And so where does she go from that period in 1934?
So I think that she actually goes back to the Philippines briefly, and it
Mhm.
coincides again with MacArthur's return to the Philippines. He goes back there in 1935 at the invitation of Manuel Quezon to help prep the islands for independence. And Isabel Cooper, we have her coming back from the Philippines in 1936. So we know that she went because we have her
Mhm.
coming back documentation. And shortly after that trip, MacArthur meets somebody on the trip and marries her, Jean Faircloth. That's his second wife.
Mhm.
And he retires from the U.S. Army, the U.S. military as a four-star general, and basically hangs out in the Philippines, palling around with Manuel Quezon.
Right.
Isabel Cooper comes back to the United States, and we know she gets married in 1938
Hmm.
to that lawyer that she might have met in DC.
Mhm.
And yeah, so in 1940, we see her in Washington, D.C., because there's a census document that records her as married to this man in D.C., and she's a housewife. So
Oh,
it's
amazing.
probably the most mundane part of her entire life, right? This
This
moment that
period.
she's married, this period
Right.
where she's a
Yeah.
housewife, and that's it. She's just
Wow.
hanging out there. And this is, of course, right before World War II breaks out.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. And so again, this is it's fascinating because she's moving between the Philippines and Washington, D.C., and also Los Angeles.
Mhm.
Um, and she's anchoring herself at a time where anti-miscegenation is rife everywhere. She marries another white male in
Oh,
D.C.
her
And so,
first one, her
oh,
first
her first
marriage.
one. That's right. And so during World War II, she finds her way to L.A.
Yeah. So right around World War II, right before World War II breaks out, I think she's already starting thinking she's going to leave her husband. You know,
Hmm.
so we know she moves back to LA because she writes Drew Pearson. She knows
Hmm.
Drew Pearson owes her a big favor, right? And he's well known and he's got connections. He's got a national radio show. He's got connections in LA as well. So she basically asked him to help her break into Hollywood to use whatever connections that he has. And then a few letters later, because we have these letters due to Drew Pearson's archives, um, we find out that she also wants to divorce. By the way, I want to divorce that guy. I've been wanting to divorce him for a while now. So
Hmm.
we find out,
Hmm.
oh, she was married.
Right, right.
I
Yeah.
should note that when that census in 1940 places her in D.C. as a married woman, the census lists her as white,
Hmm.
right? And so it's interesting. You see her starting to play with her racial identity, or I don't know, maybe her husband was the one who we don't know the circumstances of that recording,
Hmm.
but it's not the first time that she is identified as white or that she plays with ideas of her who she is racially, or how she's identified racially.
Right. So this will have a kind of reverberations in her career again in Hollywood as she takes up these various roles over the next few decades. And what's fascinating about it is that she's playing all the tropes that are available to
Oh my God, all
women
of
of
them.
color. So could you
Yeah,
describe what her film career looks like? Because it's
yeah.
not terribly extensive, but also it's fascinating in the sense of the kinds of choices that women of color had available to them at the time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, not everybody had this sort of prominent film career that Anna May Wong had, right? More of the women, like Isabel Cooper, more mixed race actors, Asian actors, had careers more like Isabel. So she moves out to Hollywood, and one of the first things that actually she's able to take advantage of is the fact that all these World War II films are getting are getting shot and they
Right.
need Filipinos, they need people who look Asian in them, because all of a sudden the Pacific Theater is the new set of the action movie, of the new melodrama. And so Isabel Cooper gets her first few roles. She's a Filipina nurse in a sort of Bataan corregidor setting. She plays a Japanese geisha in another film, early in the early 1940s. She plays a Javanese nurse, right? So she plays all these sort of iterations of women who take care of military men, which is
Right.
not so far from her actual reality.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then
Right.
later on, after World War II, she starts to play. I think she's played a Native American woman. She plays a Chinese varieties of Chinese women, including
Mm,
in two Charlie Chan films. She plays a Thai concubine in Anna and the King. So there's all these sort of, those are the kinds of roles that are available to her, and
right.
most of them are not speaking roles, except for the Charlie Chan films. And so you kind of see the the scope that she had. Most of
Hmm.
the time, she worked in a nightclub. That was her main job, even though she lists herself as a freelance actor. Her
Yeah.
bread and butter
Yeah.
was dancing in a nightclub.
Right. So I'd like to talk about some of the questions of method and archive, because this is not a kind of a typical project that you could go to one particular repository of documents
I
and you could
wish.
spin out you could spin out chapters and chapters, and such a fascinating life that bounced between the Philippines and Los Angeles and Washington D.C. um, Tell me what it meant for you to kind of to think about, to try to write about someone where the archival documentation is either non-existent or it's wholly incomplete. How do you piece together a story with so few pieces available to you?
Yeah. I mean, there are a few things where you have a letter that she herself wrote, or, documentation of her arrival on various ships, right? Ports of call. Um, and then you have the films that exist. The Hollywood films uh, are still around. The films from the Philippines got all destroyed during World War II when Manila
Mm,
was bombed.
mm,
And so you just have to find the places where you might be able to get a sense of who she was. So a lot of the print and trade magazines that were actually archived in American government archives, you get a sense of that there. Um, yeah, but it was a lot of it felt like a little bit like a historical detective. And I'm not, I'm
mhm.
not trained as a historian, but I feel like at this point I should get a badge. Because you know
Right.
I initially, my initial academic training is really as a literary scholar,
Mhm.
as a cultural theorist. And at one point I found myself in LA, at the coroner's office, to try to track down documentation about her suicide,
Mm,
because in 1960. And I
mhm.
thought, I remember sitting sort of outside waiting for my Uber because it was an unsuccessful visit. Um, the person I needed to meet with was somewhere else. And, we just never touched base. And I
Mm.
just thought to myself, this is the most bizarre kind of research I've ever done in my life.
Right.
Going, trying to find her grave, trying to go, we drove around LA and Hollywood trying to find the places that she lived, because I could, if you, I found myself looking at directories from the
Sure.
1940s to find where
Yeah.
she lived. And
Mhm.
sometimes she appears, sometimes she doesn't. And so I tracked down her addresses. And so you get a sense of, the places that she went to. So it was a really different kind of research. And
Right.
sometimes there was enough to string something together. And
Mhm.
sometimes there isn't. There were definitely pleasures in the of like discovery, right? And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that's always really nice when you kind of have a little bit of a smoking gun and you're like, oh, there's a photograph of her that she sent to
Right.
somebody in 1951, and
Mhm.
this is what she looked like in 1951. And it's like just a shot of her outside. It's not a film still or anything. It's like a personal shot, and
Yeah.
it accompanies a letter that she handwrites, so you can see almost the emotion that she writes the letter with, because
Mm.
she gets a little worked up as she's
Mm-hmm.
writing a letter in 1951 to someone. And so
Mm-hmm.
those are just, you just have to kind of piece it together. And sometimes it's rumor. And in the book, there are places where I just sort of have blank pages.
Mm-hmm.
There are places where I've decided to use a different genre to kind of imagine what it might have been like to have, the moments she meets MacArthur. There
Right.
are moments where I make up gossip about her, because the gossip that is
Mm-hmm.
actually published about her is
Right.
is so is so out of this world. It's so crazy and fantastical that anything I made up sounded more like
Mm.
the truth, right? So I kind of sort of play with and juxtapose fiction and nonfiction, and
Yeah.
how we start to those lines start to get blurred.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I definitely saw that because as I was reading the book, it got me to think about imagining you as a kind of detective on the beat. I mean, you're trying to piece together motivations as to why, what's their particular state of mind at that point, and how might they be feeling, what struggles they might be dealing with, what anxieties or pressures they're trying to respond to, and you're not just filling in the gaps. I mean, you're really trying to get at the truth of the situation, and that's what's really fascinating about the style of writing, because it does shift from chapter to chapter, and it's noticeable. How would what kind of advice would you give to other folks that are trying to attempt to write in a way that also mixes fiction with nonfiction, all the while still trying to get at the truth of the matter?
Yeah, I mean, that the shape of the book and the way it's written was something that took a while to figure out. I had steeped in MacArthur biographies, because you had to know, and they were just not the way I wanted to write this book. And
Mm-hmm.
there are also so many ways in which she resists that sort of straightforward telling and definitive kind of narrative about her life. And so in a way, I had to play with genre and
Mm-hmm.
kind of refuse, while also kind of keeping what worked of the sort of biographical impulse, right? Because you have to give enough of a story so you get a sense of her, but also take back a little bit of that to create room for speculation, because she also lived and flourished in this space where there could be speculation about her, and she
Mm-hmm.
encouraged that almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the way that the publicity about her as an actor would be written. And so yeah, so I had to just kind of uh, play with genre a bit, and also indulge in writing fiction, and kind of in that imaginative way to try to fill in the gaps,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
there's no, as close as I could, and in some places where I do write in pure fiction about her, and imagine her, it's all based on an actual research, right,
Right.
um, on documentation about where she was or what she was doing at a particular time.
Yeah, certainly. Well, this gets us to this question of turning to artists. The playwright Chomet in the book that you mentioned, but then also this other visual artist by the name of Miljohn Ruperto.
Roberto, yeah.
Um, could you talk about how your turn to these artists also becomes a kind of another way to consult with the imagination, to consult with artistic imagination to help again get to the truth of the situation. Miljohn does something really fascinating with a kind of an anthology of her appearances in Hollywood. I believe that his work was called "The Appearance of
That
Isabel
was one of
Cooper."
the pieces. Yeah, so the whole exhibit was themed around her. So you see, like, you see her headshots, you see a compilation of the films of all the footage she could find of her in film, where everybody else is blurred out except for her, right? So there's this really neat tracking of her very clear face, even if it's in a margin
Right.
of the frame. Um, as she's walking through Hollywood. And in a sense, that gave me inspiration for, centering her in the narrative, rather than,
Mhm.
like, we are brought to her story. It's interesting to people because of MacArthur, but then I was like, okay, let's get him out of the way. Let's focus on her, because the way
Sure.
she tracks through through place and time is really interesting.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of ways in which both in visual art and in written work about her fiction. There has been a novel written about her that I don't include necessarily. Um, she fires the imagination, right? She is this sort of vessel of haunting for a lot of people. And when I had a
Hmm.
conversation with Miljohn about why we were both so obsessed with this woman, like, where was that coming from? A lot of that kind of reflection about that question informs the first chapter. We're like, why are we, as folks who are interested in the story, so invested, right? And so many people that I talk to about this project are invested in that sort of idea of the love story, the unrequited love story,
Hmm.
which is
Sure.
exactly what I try to topple
Right.
and
Right.
deflate
Yeah.
in the first
Yeah.
moment, right? And so I think that there are a lot of ways that dead beautiful women do a
Mm.
lot of cultural political work for people.
Hmm. Hmm. Right.
And for
And
artists, it leaves room for a different kind of imagination of what those stories could be, the kind of complexity, the almost refusal. And I write about this in Miljohn Ruperto's work. There's ways in which she refuses knowing, right? And I think he's okay with that, and that's actually part of
Mhm.
why I'm so drawn to his work.
Right. There were a couple of things that struck me about your use of Miljohn's, your reference to Miljohn's work, because he's able to piece together what are essentially bit parts that she played in, really kind of unrewarded parts. Many of them are even uncredited, and yet it amounts to, shockingly, 16 and a half minutes of airtime,
That's
and when we think about a life lived, an auntie or a mother or a sister, what they did when they went over there, what life they had, and you kind of distill it to these 16 minutes. And what's so gripping about the idea of just kind of focusing on her, it just seems so powerful to kind of think about what happened to her, this loved one, in that particular place and time. It got me to think about this artwork that also, this piece by Stephanie Sayuko,
it.
where she was able to look at the footage of Platoon. So Oliver Stone films this Vietnam tale, but he's not filming it in Vietnam. He's actually filming it in the Philippines. And so
Philippines,
what
of course.
Sayuko does is she removes all the human characters out of it, leaves the soundtrack, and you just pan across these vistas,
Wow.
and it's just the Philippines. And so for people who are aware of the foliage and landscape, she's paying attention to a different set of filmic cues. She kind of foregrounds something else that's been left behind. And the fact is, the Philippines has been standing in for other people, other places, and other times. So sadly, Bernadette, the story of Isabel Cooper ends in suicide in Los Angeles, and the trail ends there for us in this narration. And so if we're to read the biographies of MacArthur, um, we'll see that she was held to blame for the end of their affair. But you really wanted to make a point that the end of her life had less to do with this failed relationship with the general.
Yeah. So I think her suicide is what actually becomes the fulcrum for the story about unrequited love, right? That kind of attachment to the story of the brown woman being in love with a white man, so much so that she kills herself because she can't have him in the end. So it's that tragic mixed race Eurasian story that we're, Miss Saigon is sort of an example of that kind of idea. And but the suicide becomes that sort of, it becomes this weird evidence for that, even though there are two husbands in between and 2.5 decades, right? um, she commits suicide 2.5 decades after her relationship with MacArthur ends. And so I actually, at the end of the book, I riff a little bit on that moment, right? And how there's so much more room actually to speculate about why she killed herself. She's an aging actress in Hollywood. She overdosed on painkillers, so maybe she was dealing with a lot of chronic pain as a stage performer. She had been a physical stage performer, a dancer all her life in a nightclub. You can kind of guess as to the kinds of injuries she must have gotten, the wear and tear on her body. One of her last film roles is actually as a burlesque dancer in this sort of B, it's a worst film role of her life. She actually plays a burlesque dancer in a sort of mockumentary about burlesque dancers, and you see that there. That's the last bit of footage you have of her. She's whittled down. She's so thin, and so you get a sense of that this life has been hard on her. And so in that moment, I don't think she's necessarily thinking about MacArthur or how her life has been um, uh, influenced by him. I think she's just trying to survive. And in this one moment, she doesn't. Right? She makes a call to kill herself. At least that's what we learned from the death certificate, is that it was rolled as suicide. I don't know if there's a note. The documentation, the police report doesn't exist, or it wasn't archived properly, so we don't know anything more about what happens. But in a strange way, I sort of like think about it as the the one action she can take at that point that is her own agency, right? Not that I condone suicide or anything, but like as a woman who's aging in Hollywood, who she was probably constantly told she has no value. How much longer is she going to be able to dance in a nightclub at the age of almost 50, right? So you can see that there might be a lot of despair that leads her to her final act.
Right. I think it's such a tremendous act of grace that you perform by making that clear, and you state it um, really quite effortlessly, that there are many reasons why someone would want to take their own life, and yet the thing to push on here is the modicum of agency that she has available to her in that moment, in a lifetime of performing for others' desire, their lusts, their aspirations, their insecurities. She spent her life performing for others, and this kind of a delayed sense of what that behavior could mean for her really seems to be summed up in a very tragic but also a final statement by her. So Vernadette, thank you again for writing such a fascinating book. I hope many people are able to draw inspiration from not only the story, but the way you went about telling the tale. And I wish you well.
Thanks, Theo.